Marry me, and I'll give you the world. The words landed softly, almost elegantly, as if they had been rehearsed 100 times in rooms where no one ever said no. The restaurant fell quiet in that subtle way expensive places do, where silence isn't empty, but full of watching eyes and half-held breaths. Outside, rain traced slow lines down the tall glass windows, blurring the city lights into something softer, something almost unreal. Ethan Caldwell was still on one knee, his suit untouched by the world he dominated, his hand steady as he held out a ring that could have paid for a house, a future, a lifetime someone else might have dreamed of. He didn't look nervous. Men like him didn't get nervous. They made decisions, and the world adjusted. Claire Whitmore stood across from him in a simple black uniform, her apron tied neatly at her waist, a small order pad still resting in her hand, like she hadn't quite finished what she was doing before everything stopped. For a moment, she didn't speak. She didn't move. And that silence stretched just long enough to feel unfamiliar, like something wasn't going according to plan. Around them, a couple at table 12 lowered their voices. A man near the bar paused mid-sip. Someone quietly set their phone face down, as if sensing this wasn't something to interrupt. Ethan mistook the silence for hesitation, maybe even emotion. It made sense to him. Most people needed time when their lives were about to change. He had built empires on timing, on knowing when to wait and when to act, and right now he believed this was the moment before everything aligned in his favor. Claire's eyes moved, not to the ring, not to him, but to the window behind him where the rain kept falling, steady and indifferent. There was something calm in the way she watched it, something that didn't match the weight of the moment pressing in from all sides. She had seen promises before. Not like this, not wrapped in diamonds and certainty, but close enough to recognize the shape of them. Promises that sounded like protection. Promises that felt like doors opening. Promises that quietly asked for something in return. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the order pad, the paper bending just enough to show it wasn't as light as it looked. 8 hours. Into her shift, her feet ached in that familiar, dull way, but her posture stayed straight, composed, untouched by the tension in the room. She didn't look like someone being rescued. She looked like someone deciding. Ethan finally spoke again, his voice lower now, more personal, as if drawing a line between the world watching and the moment he believed belonged to just the two of them. You won't have to worry about anything anymore, he added, a small smile forming, confident, reassuring, practiced. It was the kind of sentence that had closed deals, ended doubts, secured loyalty. It had always been enough. Claire blinked once, slow, deliberate, and then her gaze returned to him. There was no anger in her eyes. No embarrassment. No awe. Just clarity. The kind that didn't rush, didn't bend, didn't ask permission. The rain outside kept falling. Inside, no one moved. And then, finally, she spoke. The world is generous, Mr. Caldwell, Claire said, her voice soft enough that people leaned in without realizing it. But I would never marry a man who thinks I am waiting to be purchased. The sentence did not rise. It did not sharpen. It simply settled into the room, steady and complete, like it had always been there waiting to be spoken. For a fraction of a second, nothing changed. The rain kept falling. Glasses remained lifted midair. A fork hovered above a plate on table 12. And then something invisible shifted. Ethan did not move right away. His hand, still holding the ring, remained extended just slightly longer than it should have, as if his body had not yet caught up with what had just happened. It was not rejection in the way he had known it before. This was different. There was no apology in her tone, no hesitation to soften the edges, just a boundary, clear and unnegotiable. Slowly, he lowered his hand. The ring disappeared back into the velvet box with a quiet click that somehow echoed louder than any sound in the room. Around them, the world began to breathe again. A chair shifted. Someone exhaled. A low murmur started near the bar, not loud enough to be disrespectful, but enough to remind everyone that they had just witnessed something rare. Not drama, not spectacle, something cleaner than that. Claire did not step back. She did not retreat into the safety of distance. Instead, she stood exactly where she was, her shoulders relaxed, her posture unchanged, as if the moment had not demanded anything more from her than honesty. She placed the order pad flat against her palm, smoothing the slight crease her fingers had left behind, a small, ordinary gesture that contrasted with everything else that had just unfolded. Ethan finally stood. The movement was controlled, precise, but there was a pause in it, a fraction of hesitation that would have gone unnoticed by most people, but not by someone who had spent years reading rooms, reading people, reading what was not said. His eyes stayed on her, searching for something that might explain it, soften it, translate it into terms he understood. But there was nothing hidden in her expression. No second meaning. No invitation to try again differently. Just truth. That is not what I meant, he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the easy confidence it carried before. It was not defensive. Not yet. Just uncertain. Claire tilted her head slightly. Not dismissive. Not challenging. Simply acknowledging the statement without rushing to fix it for him. I know, she replied. And for the first time, that seemed to unsettle him more than anything else. Because if she understood, then the problem was not miscommunication. It was something deeper. Something in the way he saw the world. A server passed behind her carrying a tray of empty glasses, slowing just enough to glance at them before continuing on, the quiet rhythm of the restaurant beginning to reassemble itself piece by piece. Claire glanced briefly toward table 7, where a couple waited with polite patience, their menus still open. Time had not stopped for them. It never did. She looked back at Ethan, and there was no rush in her eyes, no urgency to end the moment or escape it. You offered me everything, she said, her voice still even, still calm. But you did not ask me what I was already building. The words did not accuse. They revealed, and that made them harder to deflect. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. He had spent his life constructing worlds, acquiring them, expanding them, improving them. It had never occurred to him that someone might already have one worth protecting. For a moment, he looked past her, toward the rain-streaked glass, as if trying to find something there that would help him reframe the situation, regain control of it. But the city outside did not offer answers. It never did. When he looked back at her, the distance between them felt different. Not larger, just clearer, defined in a way it had not been before. Claire gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, the kind people use to close a conversation without disrespecting it. Then she turned, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with quiet finality, and stepped toward her waiting tables. No one stopped her. No one called out. The room watched her go, not because she demanded attention, but because she had changed something without raising her voice. Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, the empty space in front of him holding more weight than the ring ever had. And for the first time in a long time, he did not know what to say next. The door chimed softly as Claire moved through her section, the familiar rhythm of service returning like a quiet tide, steady and dependable, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened in the middle of it all, as if a man had not just offered everything he believed mattered and been answered with something he could not measure. She refilled water glasses, adjusted silverware, offered a small, professional smile that never lingered too long, and yet something about her had shifted, or perhaps it had simply been revealed, something that made even the most distracted guests look at her twice without quite understanding why. At table 7, she set down a plate with practiced care, her movements efficient, precise, the kind that came from years of repetition, but her mind was not scattered, not shaken. It was clear, almost still, like the rain outside that continued without asking permission from anyone inside. Behind her, near the entrance, Ethan Caldwell remained standing for a moment longer than anyone in his position ever would, not because he did not know what to do, but because for once, none of the options he knew seemed to apply. Leaving would be simple, expected, clean, but something in him resisted the ease of it, as if walking away would confirm a version of the moment he was not ready to accept. He reached for his jacket, then stopped, his fingers brushing the fabric before falling back to his side, a small, unfinished action that mirrored the conversation he had just lost control of. A man near the bar leaned toward his companion, whispering something low, the kind of commentary that follows anything unusual, but it faded quickly, because even curiosity has limits when it meets something that does not invite explanation. Ethan finally took a step forward, then another, not toward the exit, but deeper into the room, his gaze following Claire as she moved from one table to the next, not in pursuit, not yet, but in observation. as if trying to understand the rules of a game he had entered without realizing it had different stakes. She laughed softly at something a customer said, the sound brief, genuine, unforced, and it struck him in a way the silence had not, because it reminded him that the moment with him was not the center of her world, it was just one moment among many. And that realization unsettled him more than rejection ever could. He had been the center of every room he entered for as long as he could remember, not by demand, but by default, by the weight of what he carried with him. And yet here, in this space, under warm lights and quiet music, he was just another man who had spoken and been answered. Claire returned to the service station, setting down her tray, her fingers briefly resting on the edge of the counter as she exhaled. Not heavily, not dramatically, just enough to release the last trace of the moment before moving on. She reached for a pen, wrote something quickly on a small slip, then tucked it into the register with the same care she gave everything else. Details mattered to her in ways that did not need to be announced. "You okay?" another server asked in a low voice, not prying, just present. Claire nodded once, a small motion, calm, certain, and that was enough. No explanation required, no story offered. She picked up her tray again and turned back toward the floor, her path intersecting with Ethan's before either of them could adjust. They stopped. Not abruptly, but with that subtle awareness of shared space, the kind that usually passed without thought, except now it held weight. For a second, neither spoke. The noise of the restaurant moved around them, not through them. Ethan's expression had changed, not dramatically, but enough. The sharp certainty softened into something more attentive, more careful, as if he had realized that whatever he said next would not be received the way it always had been. "You meant what you said," he said quietly, not as a question, but as recognition. Claire met his gaze, steady, unflinching, and gave the slightest nod. "Yes," she answered, just as quietly, and there was no edge in it, no challenge, only truth. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then something in his posture shifted, not downward, not diminished, but recalibrated, as if he were adjusting to a different kind of balance. "I have spent my whole life building things people ask for," he said, the words slower now, less polished. "And I assumed," he paused, the sentence incomplete, because for the first time, he could hear how it sounded before he finished it. Claire did not fill the silence for him. She never did. "That everyone wants the same thing." She finished gently, not for him, but with him. The rain outside continued, steady, unchanged, and in that moment, it felt like the only honest sound in the room. Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, a quiet exhale that carried more weight than any argument could have. And for the first time that night, he was not trying to win, not trying to convince, just trying to understand what it meant to stand in front of someone who could not be moved by the world he offered. Claire held his gaze for just a moment longer. Then the rhythm of the room pulled her back, not urgently, not forcefully, but with the quiet persistence of responsibility that did not wait for personal moments to resolve. She gave a small nod, almost like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that did not need to be repeated, and stepped past him with the same steady composure she had carried all evening, her shoulder brushing the air between them, but never quite touching him, a distance measured not in inches, but in understanding. Ethan remained where he was, turning slightly as she moved away, his eyes following her not out of possession, but out of something unfamiliar, something closer to curiosity than control, as if he had just encountered a language he thought he knew and realized he had only learned half of. The restaurant continued around them, plates arriving, glasses refilled, conversations resuming in careful tones that avoided naming what they had witnessed, but could not quite ignore it either. At the service station, Claire picked up another tray, her movements precise, unhurried, the small details of her work grounding her in a way that nothing Ethan had offered could replace. And as she walked back toward the dining area, she passed a mirror set into the wall, catching a brief reflection of herself, not checking, not adjusting, simply acknowledging, the way someone does when they know exactly who they are and do not need confirmation. Ethan finally stepped back toward his table, the one that had become something else entirely in the span of a few minutes. The chair still slightly angled from when he had stood, the glass of water untouched. the folded napkin resting neatly beside a place setting that no longer held the same meaning. He sat down slowly, his movements deliberate, as if he were aware that anything abrupt would break something fragile that had formed in the space between what he had expected and what had actually happened. He reached for the glass, took a sip, then set it down again without tasting it, his mind moving through the moment piece by piece, not replaying it to defend himself, but to understand where the assumption had begun, where the certainty had taken shape, and why it had felt so natural until it did not. Across the room, Claire knelt briefly beside a table where a child had dropped a fork, retrieving it with a small smile and replacing it with a clean one, her voice soft as she reassured the mother that it was no trouble at all, and Ethan watched that exchange with a kind of attention he rarely gave to anything outside his own orbit, noticing the ease in her tone, the absence of performance, the way she moved through small moments as if they mattered just as much as the larger ones. He leaned back slightly, his fingers resting against the edge of the table, and for the first time in a long time, he did not reach for his phone, did not check a message, did not calculate the next step ahead, because the next step was not something he could plan in the usual way. A manager approached from the side, hesitant, professional, offering a polite apology for any discomfort, but Ethan shook his head before the man could finish, the gesture quiet but firm, as if to say that nothing about this needed to be corrected or compensated. The manager nodded and stepped away, leaving him alone again with a moment that did not fit into any category he was used to managing. Claire returned to his table not long after, not because of him, but because it was part of her section, part of the work that did not change based on who was sitting where, and she stood at a respectful distance, her expression composed, neutral, not distant, simply professional in the way that respected both of them. "Would you like to order anything, sir?" she asked, her voice the same as it had been at the beginning of the night, steady, courteous, without a trace of what had passed between them. And that consistency carried more weight than any acknowledgement could have. Ethan looked up at her, and for a second, the question felt larger than it sounded, as if it were asking something beyond food, beyond the menu in front of him. He considered answering the way he always did, quickly, decisively, but something held him there, something that made him pause just long enough to recognize that this was not a moment to fill with habit. "What would you recommend?" he asked finally, the words simple, almost ordinary, but different coming from him, because they carried something new, something closer to openness than authority. Claire did not react to the shift, did not highlight it. She simply glanced at the menu for a brief second before answering. "The roasted chicken is good tonight, and the house soup is fresh," her tone unchanged, her suggestion offered without expectation. Ethan nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and closed the menu. "I will have that," he said, and as she wrote it down, the scratch of her pen against paper sounded clearer than it should have, like the beginning of something that did not need to be named yet. She took the menu, gave another slight nod, and stepped away again, leaving him with a table that no longer felt like a stage, but something quieter, something real. And as the rain continued outside, steady and indifferent, Ethan Caldwell sat in a room he had once controlled and realized, with a clarity that did not demand attention, that respect could not be offered like a gift. It had to be learned like a language, one sentence at a time. The kitchen door swung open with a muted rhythm, letting out a brief wave of warmth and the quiet clatter of plates before closing again, and Claire moved through it with the same measured pace, placing Ethan's order on the pass without drawing attention to it. Just another ticket among many, just another table among dozens, and yet something about it lingered, not in her hands, not in her expression, but in the space she carried within herself, the part that did not bend for anyone, not even for a man who could have changed the direction of her life with a single signature. She waited as the chef nodded, the scent of rosemary and butter rising into the air, familiar, grounding, the kind of detail that reminded her where she was, who she was, and why she had chosen this path long before tonight. Behind her, another server rushed past, whispering something about a large party arriving late. The night continuing to build in its usual unpredictable way, and Claire stepped aside, adjusting her tray, her focus returning fully to the work in front of her, because for her, moments did not define her, choices did. In the dining room, Ethan sat alone at his table, but not in the way he had before, not in the way that came with expectation or impatience, but in a quieter way, one that felt unfamiliar and, strangely, not uncomfortable. He watched the room with a different kind of attention now, noticing things he had overlooked before, the way a server paused to adjust a chair before a guest sat down, the way a couple leaned toward each other as if the rest of the world had faded, the way Claire moved through it all without claiming any of it, yet shaping the experience of everyone she touched. His phone buzzed once on the table, the screen lighting up with a name that would normally demand immediate response, but he did not reach for it right away. He let it fade, the silence afterward stretching just long enough to feel intentional. He had spent years answering every call, every message, every opportunity as if it were urgent, as if delay meant loss. But now, sitting here, he realized that some things were only visible when nothing else was competing for attention. Claire returned with his plate a few minutes later, setting it down with a quiet precision, the aroma rising gently between them. And for a moment, it was just that, a simple exchange, food delivered, service completed, nothing more, nothing less. Careful, the plate is hot, she said, her tone steady. A small, practical kindness that carried no weight beyond the moment. And yet it felt more real than anything he had offered earlier. Ethan looked at the dish, then back at her, and there was a pause, not awkward, not forced, just present. Thank you, he said, the words simple, unadorned. And this time, they did not carry expectation. They did not ask for anything in return. They simply existed. Claire gave a slight nod, the same one she gave every guest, equal, consistent, and turned to leave. But something in him shifted before she could take more than a step. Claire, he said, her name coming out slower than he intended, as if he were still learning how to use it correctly. She stopped, turning back just enough to acknowledge him, her expression unchanged, open but not inviting, present but not leaning in. Yes, she replied. Ethan hesitated, not because he did not have words, but because for the first time, he understood that words alone would not carry the meaning he wanted them to. Earlier, he began, then paused, the sentence catching on. Something unpracticed, something honest. He could have apologized in the way he had learned, polished, controlled, effective, but that did not feel right here, not with her. I spoke as if your life needed something from me, he said finally, his voice lower, steadier. And I did not consider that you might already have everything you are willing to accept. The words were not perfect, not complete, but they were closer to truth than anything he had said before, and that was enough. Claire studied him for a moment, not searching for weakness, not measuring sincerity, just listening in the way she always did, fully, without interruption. Most people do not ask, she said quietly, her voice carrying that same calm weight. They assume. And there was no bitterness in it, just observation, the kind that came from experience rather than resentment. Ethan nodded. Once, absorbing it, not deflecting, not correcting, just letting it settle. The rain outside had softened now, the drops smaller, lighter, tapping against the glass in a rhythm that felt almost like a transition rather than an ending. Claire shifted her weight slightly, the tray balanced easily in her hand, and for a brief second, the space between them felt less like a divide and more like something undefined, something still forming. Enjoy your meal, she said, her tone returning to its professional cadence, but not losing the thread of what had passed between them. She turned and walked away, her steps quiet against the polished floor, leaving Ethan alone again, but not in the same way as before, because this time, the silence at his table did not feel empty. It felt like a place where something had begun, something that could not be bought, rushed, or decided in a single moment, something that would require him to stay, to listen, and to learn what it meant to meet someone on ground that could not be owned. The first bite sat untouched for a few seconds, steam rising gently from the plate as Ethan looked down at it, not distracted, not distant, but aware in a way that felt new, as if even something as simple as a meal carried a different weight now, not because of what it was, but because of where he was and who had placed it in front of him. He picked up his fork slowly, cutting through the roasted chicken with deliberate care, the motion unhurried, almost thoughtful, and when he tasted it, he Noticed the flavor in a way he had not allowed himself to notice things in years. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it was real, present, unpretentious, and it grounded him in a moment that required nothing from him except attention. Across the room, Claire moved through another set of tables, her pace steady, her posture unchanged, and yet there was a quiet shift in how the room responded to her now, subtle, unspoken, but there, a few glances lingering a fraction longer, a few conversations pausing just slightly when she passed, as if people sensed something they could not quite define. She did not react to it, did not adjust her tone or her pace. She simply continued, because whatever had happened earlier did not belong to the room. It belonged to her, and she carried it without letting it change the way she treated anyone else. A man at table 9 asked for another drink, his voice louder than necessary, trying to reclaim a sense of normalcy, and Claire responded with the same calm professionalism, writing down his order, nodding once, moving on, her composure not a shield, but a standard she held for herself regardless of who stood in front of her. Ethan watched this without staring, his attention quiet. Internal, piecing together something he had never needed to understand before. That dignity was not something performed in big moments. It was something practiced in small ones, over and over, until it became part of how a person moved through the world. His phone buzzed again, more insistently this time, the screen lighting up with a series of notifications that would normally demand immediate action, decisions waiting, people expecting, numbers shifting somewhere far from this room. But he turned the phone face down, the gesture simple, final, and for the first time, it did not feel like he was losing anything by not answering. He took another bite, slower now, not because he was savoring the food, but because he was allowing the moment to exist without rushing it towards something else. Claire returned briefly to the service station, setting down an empty tray, her fingers brushing the counter for just a second, a small pause, not of exhaustion, but of transition, as if she were resetting before stepping back into the flow of the room. She glanced toward Ethan's table without turning her head fully. A quick check, professional, routine, but her eyes lingered just a fraction longer than necessary, not with curiosity, not with concern, but with awareness, acknowledging that something between them had shifted, even if it had not yet taken a clear shape. She picked up a fresh pot of coffee and moved toward another table, her steps quiet, measured, and as she poured, the dark liquid filling the cup with a soft, steady sound. She listened to the conversation around her without absorbing it, the skill of being present without becoming involved, something she had learned long before this night. Ethan finished half his plate before he realized he was no longer thinking about what to say next, no longer rehearsing, no longer calculating outcomes, and that absence of strategy felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting, because it left him with something he rarely experienced, uncertainty that could not be resolved through action alone. He leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting once more toward the window, where the rain had slowed to a light mist, the city lights beyond it clearer now, sharper, as if something had been washed away, not dramatically, but enough to change how things were seen. When he looked back into the room, Claire was walking toward him again, not quickly, not slowly, just as she always did. And when she reached his table, she did not ask how everything was in the usual automatic way. She simply stood there for a moment, giving him the space to speak if he chose to. And for once, that space did not feel like something he needed to fill immediately. He set his fork down, not as a signal, not as a decision, just as part of a moment that was no longer about control. "You are very good at what you do," he said, the words straightforward, without embellishment, without hidden meaning, and yet they carried something different, something closer to respect than observation. Claire's expression did not change much, but there was a slight softening in her eyes, not a smile, not approval, just recognition of something that had been said without expectation. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady, and for a brief second, the exchange felt balanced, equal in a way that neither of them had experienced at the start of the night. She gave a small nod and turned to continue her work, leaving Ethan with a table that no longer felt like a place of transaction, but something quieter, something that asked nothing from him except presence, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The evening moved forward with a quiet inevitability, the kind that did not announce itself, but could be felt in the subtle shifts of light and sound, in the way conversations softened as plates were cleared and replaced with smaller ones, in the way the rain outside had almost disappeared, leaving behind only a faint shimmer on the pavement that reflected the city in broken pieces. Claire carried a tray of empty glasses back toward the service station, her steps steady, her mind clear, the rhythm of the night settling into something predictable again. And yet beneath that rhythm, something remained, not disruptive, not distracting, just present, like a note held quietly beneath a melody. Ethan finished his meal without rushing, without checking the time, without calculating what came next, and when he set his fork down for the final time, he did not immediately reach for the check. He did not signal for attention. He simply sat there for a moment, allowing the stillness to extend just a little longer than it normally would have around him. The restaurant continued to shift toward its later hours, a few tables emptying, a few new guests arriving, the constant exchange of presence and absence that defined places like this. And for the first time, he noticed how little of it had anything to do with him. Claire returned to his table with a small leather folder, placing it gently near his hand without interrupting his thoughts, her movements quiet, practiced, and for a moment, their eyes met again, not with the tension from earlier, not with uncertainty, but with something more settled, something that did not need to prove itself. "Whenever you are ready," she said softly, her voice carrying the same calm assurance, and then she stepped back, giving him space, not out of distance, but out of respect. Ethan opened the folder slowly, his gaze moving over the numbers without really focusing on them. Because the amount did not matter, not tonight, not in the way it usually did, and as he reached for his card, he paused, his hand hovering just above it, the gesture small but deliberate, as if he were reconsidering not the payment, but the meaning of it. He closed the folder again without taking anything out and looked up, his attention finding Claire across the room as she spoke quietly with another guest, her posture unchanged, her presence consistent, and something about that steadiness held him there, not in hesitation, but in recognition. He stood then, not abruptly, not with the urgency that usually accompanied his movements, but with intention, and as he walked toward her, the distance between them felt different now, not something to be crossed quickly, but something to be understood. Claire noticed him approaching before he reached her, her awareness subtle, practiced, and she finished her sentence with the guest before turning fully to face him, her expression open, attentive, not expecting, not assuming. "Is everything all right?" she asked, the question simple, professional, and yet it carried a quiet sincerity that made it more than routine. Ethan nodded once, a small, grounded motion, and for a second, he did not speak, not because he did not have words, but because he was choosing them carefully, not for effect, not for outcome, but for accuracy. "I would like to settle the bill," he said, the phrasing deliberate, almost formal, and there was a subtle shift in the way he said it, not transactional, not dismissive, but respectful of the exchange it represented. Claire gave a slight nod and gestured toward the table, walking with him the short distance back, her steps even, her presence steady, and when they reached it, she opened the folder again, placing it in front of him with quiet precision. Ethan took out his card this time, setting it inside without hesitation, but when he slid the folder back toward her, he did not release it immediately, his fingers resting lightly on the edge as if holding on to something beyond the paper and plastic. Claire's gaze met his, patient, unhurried, allowing the moment to unfold without pressing it forward. "Earlier," he said, his voice low, not seeking attention from anyone else in the room, "I tried to offer something I thought had value, but I did not understand the cost of what I was asking in return." The words were not rehearsed, not refined, but they carried a weight that did not need polish, because they came from a place he had only just begun to recognize. Claire listened without interruption, her expression calm, her attention complete, and when he finished, she did not respond immediately. She did not rush to fill the space, because she understood that some words needed time to settle before they could be met. The room around them continued in its quiet motion, unaware or perhaps simply respectful of the small shift taking place at a single table. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Some things are not meant to be offered, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "They are meant to be shared, if they are wanted." The distinction was simple, but it carried a depth that lingered between them, reshaping the moment in a way that no grand gesture could. Ethan released the folder then, his hand falling back to his side, and, for the first time that night, there was no sense of loss in letting go, only the quiet understanding that something else had taken its place, something that could not be held, only recognized. Claire took the folder with a steady hand, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge where his had been moments before, not lingering, not avoiding, simply completing the exchange with the same quiet precision she brought to everything she did. She glanced down briefly, confirming the card was inside, then closed it with a soft motion, the leather making a faint sound that seemed to settle something in the air between them. "I will take care of this right away," she said, her tone even, and, for a second, the words sounded exactly as they would to any other guest. And yet there was a subtle difference, something unspoken, something understood. She turned and walked toward the register, her steps measured, her posture unchanged, but her mind moved through the conversation in a way she did not often allow, not questioning it, not replaying it, simply acknowledging that something rare had taken place, something that had not tried to take from her, but had paused long enough to listen. Behind her, Ethan remained by the table, not sitting, not leaving, his gaze following her for only a moment before shifting to the room again, seeing it now with a clarity that did not rely on ownership or influence, noticing how each person carried their own world into this shared space, how each interaction, no matter how small, held its own quiet significance. At the register, Claire processed the payment, her fingers moving quickly, efficiently, the small screen reflecting numbers that meant very different things to different people. But to her, it was simply part of the exchange, a necessary detail, not the center of anything. She printed the receipt, folded it neatly, and placed it back into the folder, her movements calm, unhurried, as if she understood that the pace of a moment could shape how it was remembered. When she returned, Ethan had moved slightly to the side of the table, giving her space without needing to be asked, a small adjustment that might have gone unnoticed earlier in the night, but now carried meaning. She handed him the folder, their hands briefly aligning in the exchange, and stepped back, allowing him the time to complete it. He opened it, signed where required, and then paused again, his pen hovering for just a second longer than necessary, not because he was uncertain about the amount, but because he was considering something else, something that could not be written on a line or calculated in numbers. He closed the folder and handed it back to her, this time without holding on to it, the gesture clean, complete, and when she took it, there was no weight left in the exchange, only clarity. "Thank you for your service," he said, the phrase simple, almost routine, and yet it carried a sincerity that did not rely on tone, because it came from a place that had shifted, a place that understood the difference between being served and being seen. Claire met his gaze, her expression calm, her eyes steady, and for a brief moment, there was something like warmth there, not personal, not inviting, but human, recognizing the effort it took to change the way one spoke, the way one saw. "You are welcome," she replied, her voice soft, and then she added, after a slight pause, "and thank you for listening." The words gentle, not a reward, not approval, but acknowledgement. Ethan inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect that came without calculation, and for the first time that evening, it felt natural, not something he was performing, but something he had learned in the space of a few hours, something that would not leave him easily. Around them, the restaurant had settled into its later rhythm, fewer tables occupied, the lighting softer, the conversations quieter, and the world outside had shifted into that late hour where the city seemed to breathe more slowly. The earlier rain leaving the streets reflective and still. Claire stepped back into her work, moving toward another table, her attention returning fully to the present, because whatever had happened here did not change who she was, it simply revealed it. Ethan stood there for a moment longer, not waiting, not expecting anything more, just standing in the quiet aftermath of a moment that had not gone the way he planned, but had given him something he had not known he needed. He reached for his jacket, this time completing the motion, slipping it on with a smooth, practiced ease, but the man inside it felt different, not diminished, not uncertain, just more aware, as if something in him had been recalibrated to a standard he had not recognized before. He glanced once more toward Claire as she moved through the room, not to call her back, not to extend the moment, but simply to see her as she was, part of a world that did not revolve around him, and for the first time, that felt right. He turned then, walking toward the exit, his steps steady, unhurried, and as the door opened, a faint trace of cool night air met him, carrying the quiet scent of rain-washed streets, and as he stepped outside, he did not feel like he had left something behind. He felt like he had just begun to understand what could not be taken, only earned, one honest moment at a time. The door closed behind him with a soft, final sound, and for a moment, Ethan stood on the sidewalk without moving, the city stretching out around him in quiet lines of light and reflection, the pavement still damp from the earlier rain. Each step he could take now feeling less like momentum and more like choice. Cars passed in the distance, their headlights cutting through the mist. People moved along the sidewalks with their own destinations in mind, their own conversations, their own worlds. That did not pause for anyone, not even for a man who had once believed he could shape everything around him if he simply wanted it enough. He slipped his hands into his coat pockets, not out of habit, but out of something quieter, something that did not need to be seen, and as he began to walk, his pace was slower than usual, not because he was tired, but because he was no longer trying to outrun anything, not the moment, not the silence, not the realization that had settled into him with more clarity than any deal he had ever closed. Inside the restaurant, Claire continued her shift, clearing the last few tables with the same steady rhythm, stacking plates, wiping surfaces, resetting spaces for a tomorrow that would arrive whether anyone thought about it or not. And yet there was a softness to the end of the night, a quiet exhale that came when the noise faded and the work became simpler, more contained. She paused briefly at the window as she passed, her reflection meeting her for just a second, the faint outline of the room behind her blending with the city beyond. And she did not smile, she did not sigh. She simply looked, the way someone does when they recognize that something meaningful has happened without needing to define it. A coworker called her name from across the room, asking for help with the final checks, and Claire turned without hesitation, stepping back into the routine that had always grounded her. Because whatever had shifted tonight did not change the path she was on, it only affirmed it. Outside, Ethan reached the corner and stopped as the light changed, the red glow reflecting faintly on the wet street. And for once, he did not check his watch, did not calculate the delay. He simply waited, his gaze moving across the intersection, taking in the small details he had once overlooked, a couple laughing quietly under a shared umbrella, a delivery driver adjusting his jacket against the cool air, a man standing alone with a coffee cup, lost in thought, each of them carrying something invisible, something that could not be offered or bought or replaced. The light turned green, and Ethan stepped forward, crossing with the same measured pace, not rushing to the other side, not thinking ahead to the next meeting, the next decision, the next acquisition, but staying present in a way that felt unfamiliar and yet strangely right, as if he had been moving too fast for too long to notice what had always been there. Back inside, Claire finished the last of her tasks, tying off a trash bag, wiping down the final table, the quiet hum of the emptying restaurant settling around her like a calm after something unspoken had passed through it. She untied her apron, folding it neatly, placing it where it belonged, her movements unhurried, deliberate, and when she finally reached for her coat, she paused for just a second, her hand resting lightly on the fabric, not in hesitation, but in acknowledgement, as if she were closing one chapter of the day before stepping into the next. She stepped outside a few minutes later, the air cooler now, the rain gone, the city lights clearer, and for a brief moment, she stood just outside the door, not looking for anyone, not expecting anything, simply breathing in the quiet that followed a long shift, the kind that did not leave her drained, but steady. Somewhere down the street, Ethan continued walking, unaware of the exact moment she stepped out, and yet connected to it in a way neither of them needed to see, because what had passed between them was not about proximity, not about timing, but about something deeper, something that would remain even as their paths moved in different directions. Claire adjusted her coat and began to walk the other way, her steps light, her posture calm, her presence unchanged. carrying with her the same quiet strength that had guided her through the night. And as she disappeared into the flow of the city, nothing about her suggested she had been part of something extraordinary, and yet everything about her reflected it. And somewhere between the two of them, in the space that no longer needed to be filled, a simple truth settled, clear and lasting, that some people do not wait for the world to be given to them. They build one of their own, and the right person does. Not try to replace it, they learn how to stand beside it without asking it to change.